You're going to be excited for this part here. Ted Case, I already introduced him. He's the Executive Director of the Oregon Rural Electric Cooperative Association. Special treat here. They are a trade association for electric co-ops in the state. Now, Ted's a native Oregonian, and tell you how much of a small world it is. We both grew up in Klamath Falls together. Don't hold that against us. And we went to the same high school, and we ended up working together on legislative issues. 10 years later, I guess we've been out of high school. So now, after spending 20 years back in Washington, D.C., Ted, he's moved back to Oregon with his wife, Nicole, and their 2 children. And he graduated from Pacific Lutheran University, and he has his master's in fiction writing from Johns Hopkins University. And Ted and his wife, family live in Wilsonville now. Now, Ted spent 2 years writing a book called Power Plays, and he's going to talk a little bit about that today. I'll tell you though, Ted works tirelessly, days and nights, representing the interests of electric cooperatives in Salem and in Washington, D.C. And he's in the trenches constantly trying to educate legislators on fighting that bad legislation that I was talking about that really can have an impact on our rates. And not only is he a great friend of mine, but he's one of the finest representatives anywhere of the cooperative principles. And I'd ask that you please help give Ted a warm CEC welcome. Ted?
Good afternoon, everybody. How are we doing? Good. Well, Dave, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. As Dave said, we did grow up in Klamath Falls. He's a few years older than me. But I heard of his reputation as I was growing up. We are both fellow Klamath Union High School Pelicans, so very tough mascot there. It really scared most of our other Southern Oregon Conference schools. But thank you for the introduction again, the opportunity to be here. And I do want to thank the CEC board for lending Dave to me for the past 3 years. He was my board president, and as he noted, I often had him come over and testify over in Salem and Washington, D.C. to represent not only CEC, but the Oregon co-ops and the co-ops nationally. So he's not only a leader here in Central Oregon, but he's a leader nationally and in the state of Oregon. So thank you. You got your manager back, so I think you're probably happy about that. It's a really exciting day here at CEC, 75 years, and Dave has told you a little bit about your history. I want to tell you a little bit more about some of the stories I came through as I researched the history of electric cooperatives and the presidency. And it's a presidential election year, and so I am not a professional writer or an author. I do have a book out, but mainly, as Dave says, I spent a whole lot of time in the Oregon legislature and sometimes in Washington, D.C. I guess you would have considered me just to be a professional lobbyist. Okay? You can see by your faces how well that goes over. And I'm really proud to be in this profession for the electric co-ops. I think we wear the white hats. But I'm under no illusion that lobbyists are highly regarded by the American people or even this crowd. I didn't know how bad it was until recently, though. I was talking to this very nice elderly lady, and she was just giving me the business about lobbyists. You know, she was just saying, lobbyists are sleazy. She says, lobbyists are corrupt. We need to get rid of all of them. She says, we need to kill them. And I didn't really know what to say. I was really taken aback, so finally I just said, well, Mom. But as I researched electric co-ops, because I'm so passionate about this program, as I know everybody on this stage is, it's really amazing what has happened over the past 75 years to not only this co-op, but co-ops across the country. But we have such more of a rich history than you ever imagined, and I'm going to tell you a few of those stories today about our relationship with the United States presidency and the White House. Of course, I'm going to really focus on the early years, is the development of electric co-ops and some of the early presidents, and finish with one that was a little more recent. But it's Power Plays, it's the history of co-ops and the presidency. Of course, we can't talk about the presidency and electric co-ops without talking about Franklin Roosevelt. And of course, you can't really see him, but you've already seen that dam here today, Bonneville Dam. But there's Franklin Roosevelt in a horse and buggy in 1937. He comes out here. That power supply that was very important back then to the electric co-ops in the Northwest continues to be so important for us even today in 2016. Nothing has changed. It's a renewable source of power back then, and it's a renewable source of power right here. But we even have to go back just a couple years before then to this document here. And this is signed this into law May 11th in 1935 when only 10% of the farms had electricity. And you heard from Dave about Central Oregon's history, that there was very few farms that were electrified here, and there was a group of 9 men in Central Oregon that wanted to start this electric co-op. So Franklin Roosevelt started this program, and he had no idea how it was going to turn out because he needed a partner to start electrifying the country, and there were these little tiny electric co-ops out there, but he had no idea whether they were going to work. He wondered, he frankly had a lot of doubt whether they had the technical expertise, whether they had the business savvy to keep the lights on, get the bills paid, and do everything that this board and your great staff and the blue shirts here do every single day that we just take for granted. He didn't know. In fact, he wasn't sure at all. So he signed this into executive order, into effect, and off they went. And by 1938, there were 350 electric co-ops in the country, and they were selling more electricity than anybody ever imagined, and Roosevelt was feeling so good about this, but he was a man of also enormous ego, as well as enormous talent, but he'd never been to an electric co-op. He didn't feel like he was getting the love that he deserved for starting this program, so he identified an electric co-op to go to down in Georgia, the town of Barnesville, Georgia, and he wanted to go down there to dedicate electric co-op, and he did. He went down there in August of 1938, and they were just going to turn on the lights for 157 families. Now, you heard from Dave that the first substation that was energized here was 11 farms. Okay, so this was a big co-op compared to Central when it started out. 157 families. He went down there to dedicate it, to kind of get the little affirmation that he thought he deserved. And they did everything that they did here. They had some lemonade and they had some cookies out there. There was only one problem. What you can't see from this picture is 40,000 people showed up. Okay, they were a little short of cookies, okay, a little short of lemonade, but he gives the most amazing speech ever about rural electrification. He just talked about we were not going to stop until the last farm in this country was electrified, and it was just an amazing, amazing reception that he got. He felt so good about it that he decided he was going to change up the order of things, and that he was going to be the one that was going to flip the switch to turn on these 157 farms in the area that actually had this sort of contraption rigged up to the substation to turn on the lights. So he announced he was going to do this, and the far end of that platform, the Secret Service heard this, and they marched on down to him, and they whispered into his ear, "Mr. President, there's no way you're going anywhere near that contraption." And he was like, "Well, why not?" And they said, "We're not going to watch you get electrified in front of 40,000 people." Now, the mayor of the town of Barnesville was supposed to be the guy that flicked the switch, and he heard all of this. So now he's looking at that switch, and he's not so sure he wants to flip it. But he flips it on, and those lights come on just as they came on a couple years later here in CEC. And by 1945, when Franklin Roosevelt died, half the farms in this country had electricity. So we wouldn't be here today at the fairgrounds without Franklin Roosevelt. No matter what you think about FDR or your political affiliation, he was the one that got this program started, and he helped lift up even CEC. So he was succeeded by this man on the right. Well, it would be, yes, you know who that is. That's Harry Truman. On the left, you probably don't know him. That's Clyde Ellis. That's the first general manager of the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association, the National Trade Association, but who was also very supportive of this co-op starting here in CEC. But they were very good friends, Clyde Ellis and Harry Truman. And Harry Truman was a great supporter of electric co-ops. He had grown up on a farm in Missouri without electricity, and it was later served by an electric co-op. So he had great fondness for electric cooperatives, and he was probably the most unlikely man ever to be elected president of the United States. He was so down home and plain spoken. In fact, there's a story about him going to one of his wife Beth's garden parties. And these were society ladies, but it was a garden party. So he went, they asked him to speak, and so he said, "Okay, I'll go and speak." And he didn't know what to say, so he started talking about manure, right? Because it was a garden party, right? So he talked about manure, and he started manure this, manure that, and said manure about 20 times. And these society ladies were just absolutely appalled. And they just said, so they went to Beth, and they said, "Would you please get him to stop saying the word manure? The word is fertilizer." She says, "Heavens no, it's taken me 25 years to get him to say the word manure." But he was a great friend of electric co-ops. By 1948, though, he was a dead man walking politically. Everybody thought he was going to lose to Governor Tom Dewey, who was the governor of New York, a very elegant man, a very well-spoken man. And all the polls, the Gallup poll, all the polls just said he was down by 10 points, 15 points. The race was over, and it was all was lost for Harry Truman. And Truman had other ideas about this. And what he loved to do was to ride fast on trains. He loved trains. He loved to go fast on trains. And so he decided he was going to get on this train and go across the country on what he called the whistle stop tour. Now, I see your heads nod because you went to your 7th grade civics class and you learned about that, right? What you may not know, and what I didn't know until I wrote this book, is that the night before he got on that train to go across the country on that whistle stop tour, he went to an electric co-op meeting just like this. Just like this. Because electric co-op leaders, farmers and ranchers in his area, were about the only group that hadn't abandoned him. The only group that hadn't said that you're going to lose. And so he went amongst friends and he said, listen, I'm going to get on this train, I'm going to go across the country, and I'm going to talk about co-ops and rural electrification and hydropower and all these things. And in the end, there will be no doubt about the result. And so he did. He got on that train and he went across the country, and he actually ended up in Oregon. He started, when he came out here, he was in Portland, he went down to Salem and Eugene, and he ended up in Oak Ridge, of all places, and gave his speech. And you see everywhere he went, he talked about co-ops and REA and the hydropower. And slowly but surely, these crowds just got bigger and bigger everywhere he went. And so on election night, he'd cut the deficit to like 4 or 5 points, according to the polls, but he was still going to lose. So he goes to bed that night at 7 o'clock. Can you imagine that? He goes to bed at 7 o'clock on election night, right? You think he might want to stay up and see how he did, but no, he goes to bed at 7, and he wakes up at midnight, he turns on the radio, and he learns that he's ahead by 2 million votes. But there's Dr. George Gallup on the radio saying as soon as the rural vote comes in across the country and in the West, the rural vote in the West, that Dewey will take the lead and Truman will be defeated. Truman reportedly takes a swig of whiskey, turns off the radio, and goes back to bed. Because he had been out in places like Oak Ridge, and he had seen the reception that he got, and he knew he was going to win. So he woke up the next morning. Of course, here's here. This is actually taken from Oak Ridge, just so you know. So what did the newspaper say? Dewey defeats Truman. So this is taken the next morning. Now, I have seen the only newspaper that is signed by both Dewey and Truman. It's at the Portland Historical Society. And at the top right-hand corner, Truman wrote, "This was a mistake." And underneath it, Dewey wrote, "It certainly was." So you can see that up there, Portland Historical Society. It's just amazing. So Harry Truman, of course, left office in 1952. And I'm not going to talk a lot about Dwight Eisenhower, but here's Dwight Eisenhower, who didn't know a whole lot about electric co-ops, but suffice it to say he was not a very good friend of the program. And this is actually Dwight Eisenhower in 1959 attacking the REA loan program, saying it's costs too much and we got to get rid of it. It's outlived its usefulness. And that's Clyde Ellis, the president of the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association, glaring at him over his shoulder. And actually, when Eisenhower retired, he wrote his memoirs, and he spent a page and a third in his memoirs talking about electric co-ops and how they were subsidized and how that they just didn't understand that we didn't need REA anymore. But all's well that ends well. He retired to the Pennsylvania area, Gettysburg, which is served by an electric co-op up there. And you could find, in the mid-60s, you would find Eisenhower at his electric co-op annual meeting, just like you, holding his raffle ticket, hoping that he would win something. And he became a very good supporter of his local co-op. So he finally saw the light at the end of the day. So he was succeeded. And I'm not going to talk about every president, just so you know, but this is John F. Kennedy, who knew absolutely nothing about electric co-ops because he's from Massachusetts, doesn't have any electric co-ops, and he was an urban guy from Boston. But he knew that if he was going to become president of the United States, that he needed to get to know electric co-ops. So he would come out to electric co-op meetings and just take notes. You just find him in the back, and I found pictures of him just in the back, taking notes, trying to learn about rural issues, farmers' issues, ranchers' issues, to familiarize himself with electric co-ops. And so this is a picture of him in 1962 signing a document with Clyde Ellis in the Oval Office to take what we had learned in the United States about rural electrification and REA and exporting it to international countries, particularly in Latin America. This was right after the Cuban Missile Crisis, and John F. Kennedy wanted to figure out how we could stop more Castros from rising up in Latin America. And he thought, if we can electrify these countries, maybe they won't turn to communism, and we can stop more Castros from rising up. You guys remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. You don't want to go through that, and neither did he. And so he thought electrification was the way to do it. So they signed this document hoping that they could get some rural electric projects started down in South America, in Bolivia, and Colombia, places like that. So he, about a year later, met with Clyde Ellis and other electric co-op leaders, and they said, well, how things going? And they thanked him for his help, and he said, you know, I'm not doing well in rural areas. He said, I can't win the state of Oregon and the state of Washington. It doesn't look very good for me. And he says, you know what I have to do because I can't win those states? I got to go down to Texas this November. This was in 1963. So he had to go down to Texas to try to get those electoral votes and to raise money. And you guys all know, you all remember, I see your heads nodding, you all remember what happened on November 22nd, 1963, when he was assassinated. Now, there's a lot of books written about what would have happened if John Kennedy would have lived, and we have no idea. But I tell you one thing that he'd been very proud about is this meeting that took place in the Oval Office in 1962 put a program in place that has provided electricity for 100 million people in the world. And I think he'd be pretty proud about that. An amazing program. So he was succeeded by Lyndon Johnson, who needed no introduction to electric co-ops because he had started one himself. And this is Lyndon Johnson with the youth tour kids back in 1965. And I know we had those youth tour kids here, and they're just amazing young people. And this program was going on back then. I'm so glad CAC is involved in that because those are our future leaders. But Lyndon Johnson was a great supporter of electric co-ops because he had grown up in the Texas Hill Country, which was said to be the last place in America to get electricity. He had grown up without electricity and just utter poverty because they didn't have the density to get an REA project going. You needed 3 persons per mile of line to get an REA project back then, and they only had 1.5. It was so sparse. If you've ever been down to the Texas Hill Country, it's just one hill, and I've toured it, one hill after another, just one hill after another. And nobody lived out there. And they said, you know, you got too much land and not enough people. But he wanted to get electricity out there, so he went to the President of the United States, who was Franklin Roosevelt. Went 2 separate times, and he just absolutely wore on FDR. He said, you've got to help me. He's 29 years old. He was just a congressman, 29-year-old congressman. This is back in 1939, right around the time CEC was starting to develop. And so he went to Roosevelt, and he said, you got to help me out. And finally, Roosevelt was just tired of it. He was just like, I got to get this guy out of my office. So he picked up the phone, and he called the administrator of the REA, and he says, listen, I know this is against the rules, but just give these people their loan. Let's get some electrification in the hill country. He says, this density issue is not going to be a problem. He said, they breed pretty fast down there. So they got their loan. The lights came on. People down in the Texas Hill Country started naming their children after Lyndon Johnson. You can't believe the number of people in the Texas Hill Country named Lyndon. And that electric co-op down there, Pedernales Electric Co-op, is now the largest electric cooperative in the United States of America. Okay? It just grew up so much. They did breed pretty fast down there, apparently. But so Lyndon Johnson, great supporter. So we've had this history of great supporters with occasional folks that have not, like Eisenhower. And then we got to this guy. And whatever you think about Richard Nixon, he didn't like electric co-ops at all. And this is a press conference in 1972 where Richard Nixon was asked why he was cutting the REA loan program. He essentially wiped it out. He just said it's not needed, it's not necessary, we don't need these electric co-ops. So he said, they said, why are you, this is a presidential news conference, and the press asked him, why are you cutting REA? And he says, they used to serve a purpose, these co-ops, but now they just serve country clubs and dilettantes. That's a quote, country club and dilettantes. Now I don't even know what that means, but that doesn't really reflect CEC's area, right? Not a lot of country clubs, not a lot of dilettantes. And he was asked later, his press secretary took a lot of flack for that, and they said, what did the president mean by that? And his press secretary said, Richard Nixon is not thinking about electric co-ops. That was off the cuff. He doesn't care about these co-ops. He's got other problems to think about. Watergate, of course, was going on at the same time. But the thing about Richard Nixon that's so appealing for sort of amateur historians like myself is that he taped everything. And I mean everything. And if you're willing to listen to his tapes, and you can occasionally find a little nugget. And I found a little nugget, and I just want to read you. This is the only little passage I'm going to read you from the book. But this is Richard Nixon in the White House in a meeting on the budget. And we kind of get a little sense of what he thought about it. So this is a bunch of Republican leaders, and they're talking about what to do with REA. And the meeting is led by Caspar Weinberger. Remember that name? He was the head of the Office of Management and Budget. So nicknamed Cap the Knife for his ruthless cost-cutting ability, Weinberger argued there was no economic justification for 2% REA loans for 80% non-farm uses, what she described as suburban developments, country clubs, and recreational developments. That's what they thought our service territory looked like, which is just absurd. Then Nixon interjected, and the cabinet room became eerily quiet. All of the members know, as I know from long experience, Nixon warned, the electric co-op's vicious lobbies you'll ever run up against. The words of Richard Nixon. Now, I'm really proud of finding that little nugget. It's never been reported before until I wrote this book. A little double-edged sword on that. I had to listen to hours and hours of Nixon tape in my office, which also doubles as my kids' playroom. So as I was listening to these tapes, my then 7-year-old daughter was in there playing with her Barbies all the time, and so consequently she can now swear like a sailor, okay? Richard Nixon had the foulest mouth you'll ever imagine, but anyway, he was, of course, resigned under pressure in 1974, and there was a period then that there was not a lot of attacks on electric co-ops. I just want to point out one particular leader here. This is Bob Berglund, who was the third general manager of the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association, but he was also the Secretary of Agriculture for Jimmy Carter. Of course, Jimmy Carter's father had been electric co-op director, just like all these fine folks here. And actually, Carter says that because his dad was on the co-op board, it gave him the idea to go into public service. Because these guys are serving you, every single day, working hard on your behalf. And Carter saw his dad do that and decided he wanted to get into public office and later became president. But Bob Berglund served as his Secretary of Agriculture. But in 1976, when Carter won, Berglund and Carter didn't know each other at all. And Berglund was a congressman from Minnesota. So he went down to Plains, Georgia to meet Jimmy Carter. And so they could talk and see whether they got along. And they just hit it off right away. And Carter says, I'd like you to be my Secretary of Agriculture, but you've got to pass an FBI background check. And Berglund said, that's fine, bring it on. I got no skeletons in my closet. So he goes back to Minnesota feeling really good about his chances to be Secretary of Agriculture, but he made one huge mistake. So a few days later, the FBI shows up at his mother's door in Minnesota, knocks on the door, and Mrs. Berglund comes to the door and says, hello. And they said, well, Ms. Berglund, we're from the FBI, and we're here to talk about your son, Bob. And without missing a beat, she looks at him and said, he robbed a bank, didn't he? Mothers have such great faith in their sons. So I want to fast forward on now through the rest of the 70s and 80s and 90s, really to 2001, where I come into the picture a little bit. I lived in Washington, D.C. for many years and was a lobbyist for the co-ops back there. And George W. Bush was the President of the United States. And his ranch down in Crawford, Texas, served by electric co-ops, so he knows the co-ops, and he's really interested in energy issues. He's a Texan, of course. And so we were working on energy legislation back then, and it was a brilliant day, September 11th, 2001. And so I'm on Capitol Hill, and we see that a plane hits the World Trade Center, then another plane, and then the plane hit the Pentagon in the town that I was at, and I could see the smoke trailing up from the Pentagon. And we were told that there was one more plane left out there and that we needed to get off Capitol Hill because they thought it was headed to the U.S. Capitol. So we hightailed it off Capitol Hill. And right about that time, an electric co-op manager in Pennsylvania, a guy by the name of Rich Bauer, holds the same job as Dave does at CEC, runs the co-op, he's the CEO. He got a call about an outage in a little town called Shanksville. And so he did whatever, Dave would do. He got his crew out there, and he got in the truck himself and headed out there. You got to get the lights back on. The rest of America was watching on TV this horrific events going on, but he went out there, and he and his flying crew were the first in that field, September 11th, 2001, where they found this. That is the aftermath of Flight 93, which hit the ground, going 600 miles an hour, and plowed into there, about 40 feet down in there. He won't talk a lot about what happened that day, but that co-op became sort of the centerpiece of the recovery effort for Flight 93. Of course, those were heroes that had took down that plane from the terrorists and saved either the White House or the U.S. Capitol from total destruction. So the co-op really became the centerpiece of the recovery effort as the FBI came in there and the FAA and the state police as they went in that recovery effort. And not long after, President George W. Bush showed up to that field and thanked the co-op for their role in that recovery effort, because they brought blankets to everybody, they fed everybody for weeks on end, and the co-op, just as CEC is, became sort of the center of the community and such a large part of the community. So as you can see, electric co-ops have played quite a role, probably more so than you thought, in the history of this country. It's an amazing history, it's a storied history, but it's a history that's not yet done. All right, 75 years old at CEC, they've done amazing things, and there's more amazing things to do. And I have pledged that I'm going to tell future stories about electric co-ops, because there's going to be more stories to tell. It's going to be a few years before I write this book. I'll probably be bald by the time I write the thing, but I'll do all the things that you need to do to write a book like this. You got to do the research, you got to interview people and go to presidential libraries, but you, as CEC members, have probably the most important role in the whole thing, and that is you get to write the ending. Thank you very much. It's great to be here, and happy anniversary to CEC.